from London. My name is Kristin Hausler, and I am delighted to welcome you all at this online event on the toppling of the statues that have recently taken place all around the world. I'm delighted to welcome, of course, our fantastic panelists of the day, which will be able to bring very different perspectives from all over the world. I will introduce them in turn. They will each be given a few minutes to give their perspective on the events. We will then proceed at the very end with about a 15-minute Q&A session, which will be led by Professor Stephen Gallagher of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who is the co-organizer of this event. So please, if you're listening into this discussion live, do use the Q&A function of Zoom. Put your questions in writing as we go along the way so that Stephen can select a few questions that will be passed on to the panelists at the very end. So we will start the discussion with the events that took place in the UK and move all the way to Hong Kong, and we'll end with a discussion of the notion of cultural heritage and how it's been understood at the global level and how it informs the current debate. So what has happened in the UK, I'm sure all of you will be have heard of this event, will be familiar with them. So we've had, of course, the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, which was kind of the first key event in the UK. The statue ended up in the harbour. It's actually been replaced, I believe, just yesterday, a couple of days ago. We'll discuss that with Marty in a bit. This has been followed by the removal of the statue of Robert Milligan, which was standing in front of the Museum of the Docklands in London. Robert Milligan was a slave owner and owned plantations in Jamaica. We also have the ongoing discussion, of course, of the statue of Cecil Rhodes in Oxford, which has not been removed, but which should be removed within the next few months or year, following inquiry and further debate. Now, some have called the actions against those statues as criminal acts, and there's even been calls to adopt a new bill against the desecration of War Memorial that has been mentioned by members of the government. The whole movement asks further questions that are interesting for those working on heritage issues. What kind of heritage should be protected? How? And who makes a decision about the protection of heritage? Who should be consulted? So those are some of the questions that we will be discussing today with our panelists. And so I'm very pleased now to hand the floor over to Marty Burgess, who is an ideal panelist today because she's both a lawyer and an inhabitant of Bristol. So I would like to hear from you a little bit about your views as to what should happen to the statue, but perhaps you could first walk us back a little bit to the events that happened and how they have been viewed by the community in Bristol.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I just would like to put a caveat out there. I'm an ordinary Bristolian, and so I'm going to walk you through the history as I understand it, and I might get some facts wrong. So I don't want to be, I just want to put it out there. I'm just an ordinary citizen who has strong views about the city I live in. Bristol, so if I talk a bit about Bristol and Colston and then bring it up to present day. So Bristol has always historically been a trading city. It's it always has been and probably will always remain an outward facing city because it's a port city and its whole wealth of the city is based around trade. I mean, historically, if you go back, Bristol's got it was the main port where wine came in from Bordeaux. Hence it's twinned with Bordeaux. It's twinned with many other port cities across the world. Now it's probably one of the cities where the most goods that come in from the Far East, so Hong Kong, for example, will initially come into the UK via Bristol. So as I said, it's always been an outward-facing city, and in fact, it was involved in a slave trade before the transatlantic slave trade. It was involved in the trade in human beings who were from the Midlands to Ireland, and that was outlawed, I think, as somebody's saint called Wulfstan. He advocated for the outlawing of that particular slave trade in the 13th century. So when Britain decided that it was going to make money from the transatlantic slave trade, initially there was a monopoly for London with the Royal African Company, and that monopoly stood still for a number of years. And Colston, who was somebody who was born in Bristol but actually never really lived here, he became a member of that society and actually worked his way up to the top and advocated for Bristol to be allowed to get in on the action and make money out of the transatlantic slave trade. Hence, he became a hero for the Bristol merchant class who wanted to get involved and make money out of pure misery. But I guess they saw it as a, I mean, you often see it touted around that at the time it was considered a respectable trade. I mean, I personally would dispute that, because there's lots of evidence to say that ordinary Bristolians, or there were plenty of Bristolians who were opposed to the slave trade throughout. However, one of the arguments gets touted is that it was a respectable trade at that time, and it was just a way for people to make money. So during, Colston became the de facto CEO of the Royal African Company, and during his time, just under 90,000 Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic, and during the crossings about 20,000 died, and that's including children. As the merchants, and there are the merchants in Bristol have historically been very powerful via various societies, and the fact how much wealth they had. He was always seen as a hero. He died, so he lived 1636 to 1721, and was actually brought back to Bristol and buried here. And some of the myths of Colston are a bit fanciful, but one of the myths I hear, which kind of make me laugh, is that he was buried in one place in the city, and then they decided to exhume his body and move it somewhere else. And when they exhumed his body, apparently it was in perfect condition. It was as if he died yesterday. And that is one of the myths, and hence they, the merchant venturers, I think they took a lock of his hair and his toenails, and they put them on display to prove how much of a saint he was, because his body was not destroyed. And whether you believe any of that, I mean, I don't personally. I just think that he was picked on as a hero. So fast forward to, so he died. I don't know much about what happened in between his death and the rest of the time, other than Bristol became a very wealthy city based around trade. It did get overtaken by other cities such as Liverpool. It became its wealth because of the size of, and it's been explained to me that the size of the ships in and out of Bristol could only be a certain size because of our docks. Whereas the boats out of Liverpool could be bigger, hence Liverpool taking over. I mean, as I said, I'm not a historian. This is just what I've been told. And Bristol continues to be a trading city. As I said, we've got a quay called Bordeaux Quay. We're known for bringing goods in and out of the city. So it wasn't the only goods that we traded in. And sugar became synonymous with Bristol, and tobacco, to where a tobacco city, Imperial Tobacco, is still based in Bristol. And so we continued being involved with the goods that were produced by enslaved Africans throughout the Americas. However, fast forward to the industrial age, where the age of Brunel, etc., then and the Victorian era, Bristol had gone through a lot of troubled times in terms of conflict around who deserved the vote, who deserved the power in the city, and we're quite good at rioting in Bristol, as you probably riot over Tesco's most recently, but back in the sort of 19th century, there were riots about working class people wanting more rights. And after that, Bristol came through that period. The people who were in control of the city, the merchants, kind of wanted a unifying figure for everyone in the city to get behind. And for some reason, they picked on Colston. And it's been Madge Dresser, a quite well-known historian. Her views on this were that Colston was seen as a Tory, but who had liberal values, hence him seen as a unifying figure. So during that period, and this is in the late 19th century, it was proposed that a statue of Colston was put up, and that they asked the city, ordinary citizens, to pay for this statue to be put up, and actually very little money was raised. So the argument that he's the son of the city is probably actually, even if you look at the time the statue was put up, ordinary Bristolians actually didn't put their money forward. It ended up being paid for by the rich merchants. And so around this time, when he died, he left his money to primarily charitable causes in the city, and specifically around a certain belief system around Church of England Christian values. So his money was left to the merchants to look after it for the benefit of the people of the city. So hence there are schools founded, lots of adult social care establishment, almshouses and things like that. So at the time of hence him being seen as a Tory with liberal values. So the statue went up, and it pretty much stood there. I think people think just a statue, what people walk past. And it wasn't really until my brother went to Colston Boys' School, and they used to march them down from Stapleton to the centre of Bristol, which is a good few miles. And they used to get given a Colston bun on his birthday, and they'd get a coin. And so all throughout my childhood, whilst my brother was at Colston School, I never knew that Colston had a connection to the trading people, and I think most ordinary Bristolians did not know that. It wasn't until the 90s, and Paul Stevenson, who is a civil rights activist who's been based in Bristol for a large proportion of his life, made a stink. Why is our concert hall named after him? Why have we got a statue? Why is at least about 10 things in that city centre all named after Colston? The Colston Hall, their view was that we're not named after him, we're just named Colston Hall because we're on the street, Colston Street. But there's also up the road Colston Yard, there's Colston Arms, there's Colston Tower, and and then there's various businesses and boats and things named after Colston. So you can see that when you're a black person walking through Bristol, Colston is, or has been until very recently, been ubiquitous. There's 3 schools. My children went to Colston Primary, which was a state school. My brother's school was a private independent school. However, it's everywhere you go in Bristol, there's Colston. And so in the 90s, it was, that's where the discussion really first started. Is this right? And since the 90s until present day, it's been a huge debate in Bristol, and various things happen which get the discussion going. And the change, I feel, from the 90s to quite recently has always been that you guys you haven't got any right. You're not an ordinary Bristolian. You haven't got a right to a voice, and this is our history. Leave it alone. And the argument's always shut down. The local paper will have held various ballots, and it always comes that the ordinary Bristolians don't want to see the Colston's our hero, just leave it alone. And that has continued that debate. I think where it has changed in recent times is the Rhodes Must Fall, and the academics who came to Bristol to support movements like the Countering Colston movement, and really changed the level of the debate. And the level of the debate in the last 5 years has just gone up a notch, and to the point where the Colston Hall changing its name, which happened 3 years ago. I was a board member at the time and really advocate. In fact, the only reason I became a board member was to advocate for this change. And it really came to the point where most of the people at a certain level who were arguing to keep Colston's name we're finding their arguments becoming weaker and weaker against the sheer academic work that's been put into what Colston really stood for. And it's been like a series of dominoes culminating into the sort of beautiful, poetic, I think, toppling of the statue and throwing it into the river. And so how this is made, as I said, as a black person walking through Bristol with that, it has always been a bone of contention and something that is very viscerally personal, that if my city thinks this is a symbol of the city, then obviously I'm not welcome here, or I'm being told that this person who, for me, it epitomizes the oppression. My family are Jamaican. They would have been my ancestors would have been transported in one of those boats. If I can't walk through my city and not see that, then I don't think my city gets that I belong here too. And so I guess where we are now is the statue's come down. It's been a huge debate, worldwide. You've got people commenting on it all over the world. However, as a city, we've got a lot of division, and we need, to some extent, we need to be left alone to sort it out for ourselves. But things keep happening which trigger it again. I mean, yesterday somebody put a statue, and it's a beautiful statue of a woman doing a Black Power sign, and I liked the statue what was put up, and I went to see it yesterday. However, I understand that it does feel again like something's been imposed on us, because it's a famous white artist has put up the statue, and it's created another debate. I mean, I started work at 9 o'clock this morning. I was already tired by 9 o'clock this morning, because since 7 o'clock I've been debating about the statue yesterday. So yes, it's been a really pivotal moment in our city's history, but we understand that the reverberations are throughout the world. However, Bristol is an interesting city in that it's always outward facing. We've got a very long-standing Caribbean community that live here. We've got lots of new people who've come in from all over the world, particularly East Africa, a lot of Polish people, and we've got a local population, and we all think very differently about that statue, and we all have a view on where we should go now. And I think to some extent we need to be seen to go have that discussion ourselves. And also I think if we can crack it, we'll be again looked on as a city that is forward thinking and progressive. That's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marty, for this wonderful introduction. I think you touched on a few very, very important issues. One point that I found very interesting in the statue, and which is, I think, common to a lot of these statues, is that they were not put up generally at the time when that person was living or right after their death, but years after, decades after, and often in a way to use a historic figure to create a sort of present narrative or narrative for the future. So history is constantly, in a way, revisited. So this kind of conflicts with the view of some who have responded to the destruction or the removal of statues, saying that history, should kind of not be touched, that this is heritage, and it kind of should stay there. So, but this history is, of course, constantly reinterpreted. So I found that one really, really interesting. And I think the other thing that you mentioned about Bristol as a city, and you talked about the division, about the sentiment of oppression as well, is that we're talking here about statues, but really they do mean a lot more. So I think that the way we address these movements to remove the statues are really important to address all those underlying issues. So I think something, of course, to bear in mind, we're not just talking about objects here, but really about their symbolic meaning. So thank you for your wonderful walk through the history of the Colston statue. I will now pass the floor to Dr. Richard Benjamin, who is the head of the International Slavery Museum, which is part of the National Museums in Liverpool. He's been appointed to this position in 2006 already. And he has a background in community and race relations, as well as a PhD in archaeology. So what I would perhaps ask you as a museum person is what has been the reaction, I mean your own reaction, but the reaction of your museum more in general to the toppling of the statues in the UK, and in particular, of course, that they should end up in museums such as yours.
Well, thank you, Kristin, and welcome everyone. Yes, I mean, museums have been mentioned by many people during the recent toppling of statues, and indeed, you know, what will happen in future to the Rhodes statue, for instance. It's quite interesting as a museum person, because of course the history around the statue, not just the history in the sense of who that person is, but actually the real-time history of the fact that you're not erasing history by toppling the statue, but you're making history. So look at, you know, Marty's a Bristolian. I think it's really interesting. She's been talking about what it means to her. And for me, that's the crux of this, is what it means to the individuals involved in the toppling of the statues. So we were contacted very quickly by people from around the world to say, you know, would we as a museum be interested in taking the statues? And you know, it's not as simple as that, because so we're based in Liverpool. You know, Liverpool, we're the national museum, and you know, Liverpool was the epicenter of the transatlantic, you know, slave trade post 1740. So we looked at it. It was an interesting request, because yes, we would find the statue interesting, and we would revision that statue, we would reinterpret it, and we would have the voices of people like Marty and ordinary Bristolians, etc. Colston as an individual would actually not be the real focus of this. It would be what his legacy has meant to the people of Bristol. Equally, we were a little bit worried that we didn't really want a Bristol statue to come to Liverpool, because it's something for the people of Bristol to engage with. So we were very much kind of like, yeah, we would consider it, but I'm pleased that the discussion has now focused more on Bristol museums taking the Colston statue. And, you know, what would be an interesting juxtaposition, although this is a Bristol discussion as well, is what happens to the Jen Reid statue that was put up and has now come down, I believe, straight away. So, you know, for me, that's a really interesting juxtaposition there. So what the museums in Bristol will do, they've got a real opportunity there, I think, for really interesting kind of dialogue. So as a museum, yes, the statues and the stories behind them and the real-time history is of great interest. I find it quite interesting that people mention museums immediately. An analogy I use, not to be flippant, is it's a bit like an elephant's graveyard. It's like when statues topple, put them in a museum. And that does make sometimes people that museums are very static beasts, and they're not, they're organic. They're part of contemporary discussions. So for us, the first thing was, you know, what are the people of Bristol thinking and talking about? It wasn't necessarily, oh yes, we're the National Museum, we'll take the statue. So I do think people need to realize that many museums, our own, it's not just about, you know, representing a historical figure. It's about what that means to societies today. And if that would enhance the discussion, yes, I would consider taking a statue into the collection, but it would have to speak to contemporary issues. What interests me about the Colston statue in particular, because I do know people in Bristol from the museums, and I do believe there was a discussion, Marty might correct me on this, but about a year ago or so, there was a discussion at looking to at least add some interpretation to the panel that existed on the Colston statue. And that as a discussion did not progress. I found that quite interesting, because obviously there is a very technical issue here. Statues and the plinths they are on people's property and are owned by somebody. Even though the narrative should be owned by the people, physically they are owned by somebody else. So there wasn't agreement on that case, and probably for other statues around the world, on having interpretation that spoke to modern audiences. And for me, with the Colston statue, with Black Lives Matter, these aren't new discussions. They've been going on, and there's been many activists who've been discussing these, and we've got some fellow speakers here from other parts of Europe that will have their own stories. So it's not a new discussion, but there is a moment, there's a convergence of narratives that kind of happened at the same time. And I think it's, for me, there's a side of me that can be quite cynical in the sense that you see a lot of statements that have been made by large organizations or museums that probably haven't really thought about this in the past, but they've had to react because there's so much dialogue and there's so much kind of overt action, i.e. throwing a statue into a dock, that people have had to react. So there is a sign of it, thinks it's good that we've moved forward. We are in a moment, but what will happen in the next 3 months and the next 6 months and the next 9 months when those statements come off the panels on the walls of museums, or go off somebody's website? What happens then? So for me, it's about longevity on slavery, both historic, contemporary. It's part of our US these dialogues, but it isn't for another big news story comes in. So I think it's fascinating what's happening in Bristol, because I think that kind of overt action will happen in other cities around Europe, and that will probably move the discussion forward. Even though it's been a discussion for many years, people and organisations are really having to react to this. But it would have been nice if they'd have maybe done that before a statue was thrown into the dock. But anyway, we are where we are, and I think Marty's hit the nail on the head. It's a Bristol discussion first and foremost, and I think that should be for any cities that are involved in that. But equally, there needs to be a long-term discussion about other statues, street names, etc., around Europe and the world, and to get to a place. And I like the analogy Marty made about a family, because it's one thing I've always argued. I have a young family, and I think if you can't walk through your city and point out the name of a street or who is on the plinth on a statue, and you're not proud of them, they don't speak about a progressive city, then what are they doing other than offending some people? So it's not erasing history. This discussion is about making history for me.
Thank you very much for your sharing with us your views on the event in Bristol. I would perhaps ask you one more question before we move on to the situation in another country. Is that the mayor of London Sadiq Khan has mentioned that there would be a review of monuments throughout the city, and has encouraged other towns and cities across the UK to do the same. He has also made a sort of a pledge towards a national museum of slavery. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that as the head of the International Slavery Museum.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I suppose our name doesn't help, does it? We call ourselves international, yet we are the National Museum of Slavery. So that hasn't helped us. I'm very collegiate in how I work, and over these past 10 years, there isn't a city or a museum organisation that's approached me and where we haven't been willing to have that discussion. What I say to people is, for the narrative, for instance, of transatlantic slavery and its legacies, to be truthful and honest, there needs to be a spine across the whole of the UK. It needs to start on the south coast, go to Bristol, London, Liverpool, go up to Glasgow. So you need to talk to one another, because if you don't, you'll kind of sometimes make your own stories up and people won't necessarily engage with that. So do I think there needs to be another national museum? Well, no, because one exists and we still haven't finished our own journey. You know, we've been open since 2007. We've had 4 million visitors, but because of the financial situation in our sector, it's been very difficult to finish off our project. We already own a building called the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. building on the Royal Albert Dock in Liverpool. Some of you people here will have been there. If you haven't, please go online, have a look at it. It is literally the iconic building on the Royal Albert Dock. And that building's not open regularly because we don't have the funds to do that. The plan is to make that the front door of the International Slavery Museum. Because at the moment we have galleries on the 3rd floor of the Maritime Museum. If we're successful in the next few years, then that moves on this narrative that we're having here today. I'm a pragmatist as well. Having a discussion around another national museum in another city will detract from that plan, and I don't think is helpful. What I think is helpful is whether or not there are institutions, or whether that be a gallery that exists that focuses on transatlantic slavery and its legacies, that work together with other institutions around the country, works with us very closely, shares some of our experiences. But I wouldn't put the time and effort, because it will be an excuse for some bodies to not fund anything if there are all these discussions going on. So let's be pragmatic. Let's get the International Slave Museum over the line, and that will help all the other discussions and institutions, whether it be in Bristol or whether it be in London. And I've met a lot of people involved in that discussion in London, and some of them were aware of us, others weren't. If you're not aware of us, you might ask for a national museum. And a lot of the voices that I saw on the media, well-known people, they obviously hadn't heard of us, which in itself was worrying, because they were calling for a national museum, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I thought was interesting, because they'd heard of that, but they hadn't heard of us. So that says something about the funding in our sector, why we've fallen off the radar, you know, because we work very closely with the Smithsonian, and we've got a memorandum of understanding with them. So we're here, let's get our project finished, and I think it will benefit the narrative nationally.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your views on this. I think you make a very good point with regard to funding. I mean, so many people have immediately mentioned museums when we talk about what do we do with those statues. I've seen a question coming in about the model of what was used following the crumbling of the Soviet Union and the installation of parks. That's for those statues. That's possibly another option. But of course, museums are kind of the first response. We recognize the role, the educational role of museums. So I think funding must be given to these museums to actually do what we expect them to do. So thank you very much for sharing your views. We'll now go beyond, across the channel, and go beyond the UK and hear from Dr. Bambi Coupens, who is a curator at the Africa Museum in Tervuren in Belgium. You have a PhD in anthropology, and I understand your main research is on the colonial history of Belgium and the Congo. So I would like to hear a little bit from you as to what has been happening there, with, in particular, with regard to the statue of King Leopold II.
Well, to pick up something that Richard said, so this is not a new debate, and in Belgium certainly colonial statues have been contested in various municipalities since roughly the end of the 1990s, when it's really the translation of the book by Adam Hochschild that has finally, as it were, transformed perspectives on Leopold II in Belgium across two sides of the linguistic border. So for instance, I was invited to participate in a working group that was in 2008. So what we see now indeed is a momentum that activists have seized in the wake of what happens internationally with Black Lives Matters, and then including the events in the UK and other locations as well. Whereas Rhodes Must Fall, for instance, has not had the same impact. And that was probably because in Belgium, it was much more considered a local event, whereas Black Lives Matter is really something that has been observed going on in different locations. Now, the museum in which I work is, of course, in a very real sense, the biggest colonial monument in Belgium that was created by Leopold II in 1897, has always been and continues to be very contested. Right up until the reopening. So we closed for a major overhaul in 2013 and reopened at the end of 2018. So right until the closure, there was still a lot of white Belgians who were very nostalgic for the old permanent exhibition, arguing that we should preserve it as a museum of a museum, i.e. Colonial representation of Africa and Africans, although in reality the permanent exhibition was post-colonial, at least chronologically speaking, whereas indeed its spirit was still very much pre-1960, as it were. And then by the time that the museum reopened at the end of 2018, again, under influence of international debates, public debates in Belgium had changed, because in the meantime, there has been the publication of the report on restitution of African cultural heritage in France. That clearly influenced Belgian public debates, and then also the movement for emancipation of people of African descent has really taken off, since around the same time that the museum reopened, and so that became a rallying point for them as well. And so then we found ourselves in a rather unusual situation that by the time the museum was reopened, a lot of people were actually arguing that it should be transformed into a museum about the Belgian, and some argued even the European colonial past specifically and exclusively, which was not the debate that we had during the 10 years that I've been working on the renovation of the museum previously. And then again, indeed, 2020, a very seminal year. First of all, and again, this is something that came up in the first talk by Marty as well, so that most statues of Leopold II were put on long after he had died, because during his lifetime and at the time of his death, he was not in the least popular, and that was not only related to the atrocities in the Congo Free State, of which he was the proprietor, but also related to his personal life, which was, how shall I put it, rather colorful. So it's only in a retrospect that he has been recreated as a genius who gave a small country like Belgium an enormous colony, roughly the size of Western Europe, and in that way put that small continental country on the map. And so most statues have been put up during the 1930s. It's also very striking that about the only colonial statues in the public domain in Belgium are related to the Congo Free State. Leopold II was king of the Congo Free State between 1885 and 1908, when he was forced to hand over control to the Belgian state. And so the Belgian state controlled the Congo between 1908 and 1960, so that was for a much longer time. Nevertheless, there are practically no monuments relating to historical figures related to the Belgian colonial past, but the statues represent almost exclusively Leopold II, some of the so-called pioneers. Those are mainly businessmen who worked there for him or with him. Also the leaders of military campaigns, in fights against Congolese, and the Arabo-Swahili traders with whom they were also in battle for the control of Congo, and then in a lot of smaller towns and cities also, in memory of people who are known locally because of the role they played in the Congo Free State, but who are not necessarily individuals who are known on a national level. And some simply commemorate, even without necessarily going into any great details of giving all the names, the Belgians who lost their lives for bringing civilization in Congo Free State. So in the wake of Black Lives Matters, activists in Belgium seized the momentum. And indeed, much of the international attention has focused upon the statues representing Leopold II, because he has become a symbol, say, of the brutality that characterized European colonial rule, certainly in the first phase of European colonialism at the end of the 19th century. But there were others that have been targeted as well. 2018, as I said, the reopening of the Royal Museum for Central Africa, which is still the official name, but also the first time that a square was named after Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of Congo, who was assassinated in 1961. In 2011, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure about the date, a parliamentary inquiry commission decided after a long research that the then Belgian government had been complicit in his murder. And so the Belgian government apologized officially to the Congolese people and the family of Patrice Lumumba. Sorry, that's my cat mewing there in the background. And so actually on the part of the activists, the two struggles have gone hand in hand, i.e. either taking statues associated with the Congo Free State out of the public domain, or at least contextualize them, and then introduce street names, statues, and so on and so forth, referring to Congolese instead. And then again, Lumumba is very much a symbolic figure. As a Pan-Africanist, as the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Congo, and then also indeed because of the implication of the Belgian government and the then Belgian king into his death. So what has happened? In the wake of the actions of the activists is that the king has offered his excuses for what happened during the colonial era to the current Congolese president, Etienne Tshisekedi. So at the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Congolese independence, Normally he was supposed to go to Kinshasa to commemorate that event, but that was not possible due to COVID-19. And because there is a sense that the king has always defended what his forebear Leopold II did, there was an implicit agreement that it actually suited him well, that he was unable to go to Congo at the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Congolese independence, and so that when on the eve of Congolese independence, the letter which he had sent to President Tshisekedi, offering his excuses for what had happened during the colonial past, took everybody by surprise, because no one had anticipated that. What was also rather remarkable is that he made the link with, and that obviously was related to Black Lives Matter, with the racism and discrimination vis-a-vis people of African descent in Belgium, which is not something that Belgian political leaders had done previously. Now, obviously, the king needed the permission of the Belgian government in order to write that letter to the Congolese president, but it clearly it served as a wake-up call also, I think, for the political class. And so the federal parliament, but then again, perhaps it is important to realize that after more than 1 year of elections, we still haven't a real federal government. So we only have a temporary government that was set up to deal with the current health crisis, which means now that Parliament can take a lot more initiative than is usually the case. And so the federal Parliament has decided to create a reconciliation commission that has to look into the ways in which Belgium should deal with its colonial past. And this includes indeed the whole debate about colonial statues and monuments in the public sphere. Now, Belgium is a federal country, so there have been other initiatives. The Parliament of the capital of Brussels, they have basically decided, so they voted a resolution to decolonize the public domain. And so they are inviting experts to constitute a working group that will actually deal with those issues. And the deadline for submitting CVs is beginning of September. And then so I'm not aware of any initiatives being taken by the Walloon government, whereas the Flemish government has decided to constitute an expert group, for which I've been invited as well, with the idea that they should draw up a list of recommendations to municipalities who are confronted with the questions or who have questions relating to colonial monuments, etc. Whereas in the meantime, you already see that some municipalities react in very different ways. One of the oldest statues of Leopold II, which was erected after he visited the municipality, not long after he became king, so during the 19th century already, has been damaged so severely that the municipality was forced to withdraw it. But it's unclear whether they will decide to actually restore it and put it back into place, whereas another, the city of Ghent, for instance, has decided to withdraw a statue of Leopold II, which has been vandalized at numerous occasions. So to withdraw it from the public domain completely. One of the most contested statues is in the coast city of Ostend. And one of the most famous activist interventions there is that at some stage, so this shows a fisherman, a man and their wives from the city, and Congolese paying tribute to Leopold II. And so at some stage, a group of activists basically cut the hand of one of the Congolese figures, with the idea that referring to the practice of cutting off hands. And then ultimately the municipality decided not to restore that, but to leave it because it was more in line with realities. But they have always very strongly opposed simply withdrawing the statue from the public domain. And so now they talk about setting up a counter statue. And so you see that whereas in previous years, for instance, like I talked about the initiative of the Flemish government, so that the idea of setting up this working group, well, actually the minister in charge is also the mayor of a town, where a few years ago, a text was put by a colonial statue, and then there was protest by people of African descent living in Mechelen, that they had not been involved in the discussion, whereas now in the light of what has happened, he has backtracked, as it were. So now he has decided that indeed there will be a new intervention in relation to that statue, but it will be done in close collaboration with local people, and more specifically local people of African descent. In Tervuren, so where the museum where I work is situated, Belgium is a very complicated country. The museum is situated in the region of Flanders, but the museum building itself is federal. But the park in which the museum is located is actually Flemish. And there a statue was erected in 1998 at the occasion of the centenary of the foundation of the museum by Leopold II, at which occasion 267 Congolese men, women and children were exhibited there in the so-called human zoo. 7 of whom died. So that statue is obviously also very contested. And the mayor of Tervuren has decided that they will decide upon a decolonial policy for all the buildings that come under the jurisdiction of the municipality within the borders of the municipality. So that you see that indeed some municipalities have already taken action, and so they are not waiting for the recommendation of the Flemish government. I have the impression that much less is happening in Wallonia, but what has happened is, for instance, also in universities. In the Catholic University of Leuven in Flanders and also the University of Mons in Wallonia have decided to withdraw statues of Leopold II in university libraries. For instance, after protests by students. But it's also, I think, important to mention that for most activists, the removal or the recontextualization of the statues is not an aim in itself, but forms a part of a broader struggle for emancipation against racism, discrimination, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the reaction of most activists after the king offered his excuses to the Congolese president was, well, this is a nice gesture, but it's just a start. What we want are reparations. And like indeed the debate about the colonial statues are part of that, as is the whole debate about restitution of the collections of the museum in Tervuren, for instance.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bambi. You have given us quite a bit of food for thought, not just walking us through the reaction, what has happened since, but also the history of the colonial era in Belgium. I was very interested in hearing about the initiatives that has been taken since the Reconciliation Commission, as well as the resolution to decolonize the public domain. So I think those are very interesting initiatives. As you mentioned, it's part of a broader discussion, what to do with the statue and the issues of reparations, that I think will deserve another webinar at some point. But let's now move on to Julien Suodo, who is a lecturer and director of film studies at Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia. He is also a filmmaker and a successful novelist. Those of you who are Francophone may be interested in his brand new novel entitled Le Sang Noir des Hommes, because it touches on these issues of the colonial era, what happened then, the atrocities, the guilt, etc. Julien has been invited to participate in this panel because he has also written quite a bit about a mural that is currently still standing at the French National Assembly and has called for its removal, but I will let him explain the issue and the controversy a little bit more in details. And I believe, Julien, you have some images as well to show us.
I do. Thank you, Chris. Before I share this presentation with you, I just want to say that there have been few instances of toppled statues and monuments, at least in mainland or mainland France or the Hexagon. There have been 2 statues of Victor Schœlcher, in Provence, in Martinique. There's been a bucket of red paint thrown on the statue of Colbert outside the National Assembly. And there's been also the renaming of a lycée, a high school that was previously called after Colbert, Rosa Parks, which is quite interesting actually in terms of our attempt to make racism as a distant and a foreign object, as opposed as racism made in France, which is what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So let me share my screen with you. Here it is. There you go. And I'll just make sure that you have the whole screen. So this mural, I'll just let it sink in for a little bit while I explain how I heard about it. My friend and colleague from Carnegie Mellon University, Mam Fatou Nyong, came across this mural 2 years ago during a visit of the French National Assembly, and she was shocked both by the mural itself, but also by the fact that it had been around for 29 years, at this point 27 years, and completely ignored by both political decision makers, but the larger public opinion. It is part of a series about the French legislative history, the history of lawmaking, and of key moments in that history. You have the institution of universal vote, the institution of paid holidays, the recuperation of Alsace-Lorraine after the war, and the first abolition of slavery in 1794, before it was re-established by Napoleon, which actually very few French students know about, but this is a discussion for another time. And it's so it's been there since 1991. It's one of 9 panels. Here's you can see where it is exactly on the map of the National Assembly. And basically, if you're a member of parliament, you have to walk past it at least once a day on your way to or out of the hemicycle. Mam and I wrote 3 articles to start a debate, a conversation about the mural. The first one in April 2019. That was the second one after the pushback that we received on several counts. We were basically advocates of the US politically correct framework because we both teach in the US. We were trying to censor a work of art, things along those lines. And so we tried to look at these arguments one by one and try to respond to them. In the meantime, interesting fact, the website of the National Assembly took down the image, the picture of the mural that basically was identified with the date, the 1794 abolition, and replaced it with that photo on the left of a black man in chain. But that was the only response that we got. And the most recent article that we published was on the French version of Slate back in May 2020. We sent this article to 10 or 12 lawmakers, member of parliaments from the different parties, and did not get a response. What's the problem here? And I'll try to, first of all, explain why for our lawmakers and for a significant part of the French public opinion, there is no problem here. The artist's defense, his name is Hervé Di Rosa, is that he paints all his characters like this. And that he's been doing it his entire life, and that we should not basically hold him responsible for that individual painting because it's actually his style. Well, actually, if you look up his work on this website, ArtNet, and there's 721 hits, you will see that, yes, he has painted a lot of characters like this along those codes, but he also happens to have very different iconographic codes, including around the time that he came up with that representation of the abolition. For us, actually, the artist style is not the problem here, nor is his anti-racist resume. He actually identifies as a very left of the center individual on the political spectrum. The problem for Mam Fatou Niang and I is the place where this mural is displayed. Buildings of the most important buildings in the French Republic, and also its function. its function is to commemorate, literally, the first abolition of slavery. And third problem, the codes, the aesthetic codes that are used for this commemoration. In France, we like to, as I said in my introduction, distance ourselves from the history of racism. This is something that happened in the Americas. This is something that happened in South Africa. And we have a lot of places, parks, subway stations, high schools that are named after heroes of the anti-racist fight, but in the United States or South Africa. And for us, the history of racism, including in the history of art, is either American, as you see here in the bottom right corner, or it could be Belgium with, of course, Tintin au Congo. And we like to ignore that we also have that history in Asterix, for instance, the pirate here, or in goods that we consume day to day, such as banania. And here on the left, you actually I actually came across that painting 2 days ago as I was getting ready for this webinar, painted by the same artist, Hervé Di Rosa, the same year that the mural went up the walls of the National Assembly. So I don't know what the message is here. What is clear to me is that he is fully aware of the iconographic history of Bagnaia and where it comes from in terms of colonialism. The argument that Mamfatou Niang and I have voiced over and over is that it is not possible to have a painting that appropriates the codes of a racist and colonialist history in a work of art that is designed as an object of commemoration. The equivalent would be a Shoah memorial with a picture or a painting that would use the stereotypical codes of anti-Semitism. And in the meantime, I'll just wrap up very quickly. As the momentum in France with gathering for anti-racist protests, this fresco went up in and it was put up by people who wanted to celebrate the memory of both George Floyd on the right and Adama Traoré, who allegedly was a victim of police violence 4 years ago. This mural was vandalized by people who did not agree with it after that police trade union and the then interior, the minister of the interior basically made noises against it. And what's really striking for us is the sort of double standard between what happened to this fresco and the absolute silence around the mural in the National Assembly. I think that that absolute silence has something to do, again, with the willingness to distance ourselves from the history of racism. To this day, there is no memorial, there is no museum of slavery or colonization in Paris as the center of the political things and where those decisions were taken. For instance, Colbert, when he invented the Code Noir. The two memorials, the two major memorials that we have, one is based here in the middle in Pointe-à-Pitre, in Guadeloupe, the Memorial Act, and the other one is in Nantes, but it's not very conspicuous. There have been recent plans by the Fondation Nationale pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage to create and design one place of memory in the Jardin des Tuileries, so where where slavery was first abolished in 1794. But it remains to be seen how big it will be, how significant it will be, what will be the message, or what will be entailed, and who will, of course, say that history. If you want some readings about it, and especially what's interesting, and this is the last slide, to compare the response, the response that we got in France to this drive to open the debate on the mural, which was basically, yes, you are trying to force an American way of thinking on the universalist approach that is the one of the French Republic. So that was in France. And in the UK and in the US, it was covered by both The Guardian and The New Yorker. Of course, people were really surprised that that debate had not started yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julien, for exposing this controversy in France. I mean, this is really, it really struck me. I mean, it's as if it would be here, I mean, in the House of Commons, really in a building. I think for lawyers is, you know, very important. It's the legislative body of the state. I think another very interesting issue also for lawyers is that the defense is around free speech and censorship. But I think your point really, and you explained it, is not really about the work of the artist itself. You're not trying to tell him what he should paint, what he shouldn't paint, but you're really questioning where this mural is currently situated. I mean, I think it could be, you know, somewhere else in a gallery, etc. But the fact that it is at the French Assembly is something that I found quite problematic. We'll move on now to Dr. Rahul Rao, who will expand and give us a more kind of global view on similar events. He is a senior lecturer in politics at SOAS and focuses on issues of post-colonialism. And he has also written quite a number of publications, and I believe has an upcoming book precisely on this topic of toppled statues. So over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Kristin, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this event. I noticed that one of the questions in the chat box was about Parliament Square and the configuration of statues in Parliament Square. And it's often suggested in relation to that space in London that the fact that Churchill is accompanied by statues of his opponents, such as Gandhi and Mandela, who of course is a figure much later in time, but would have disagreed with Churchill's views, that this somehow moderates the offense that a colonial and racist figure like Churchill might occasion. I want to suggest that the question of who represents decoloniality is not at all a straightforward one. And for me, a controversy that erupted in Ghana in 2016 was very illustrative of this. So this was a year after Rhodes Must Fall had erupted in Cape Town, South Africa. And a year later in 2016, a protest that went by the name Gandhi Must Fall erupted in Accra, at the University of Accra. The statue of Gandhi had been installed on the university campus by the President of India as a gift. And almost immediately, a series of angry articles and blog posts began to appear in which academics and students at the University of Ghana argued that this was an ill-advised statue in their context for a number of reasons. They made three arguments against the statue. First, they said Gandhi was a racist. And to provide evidence of this, they provided a number of statements that Gandhi had made across a long period of his life and career, in which he refers to Black South Africans in very pejorative terms, and in which it becomes clear that his political mission in South Africa was not so much to attack the racial hierarchy that was present in South Africa at the time, but to renegotiate the position of Indians in that racial hierarchy. They also point out that Gandhi had very regressive views on the question of caste and the caste system, which is a different form of hierarchy that is analogous to race. And this is very well known. Gandhi famously got into a series of arguments with the leader of the so-called untouchables, now known as the Dalits, B.R. Ambedkar, on the question of caste, in which he offers some very disingenuous defenses for the caste system as a kind of division of labor, as a way of accommodating difference and unity, and so on and so forth. These views were fiercely contested in Gandhi's own lifetime, most notably by Ambedkar. Now, it's important to remember that these views of Gandhi are not new. They have not suddenly surfaced. These are well-known views. But what gives them new currency in our own time, I think, is the increasing power of anti-racist and anti-caste organizing, both in India as well as abroad. Movements like Black Lives Matter that we've already been talking about. The third argument that the protesters made is also very interesting, and this had less to do with Gandhi than to do with the shifting position of India in the global kind of geopolitical hierarchy. In the very same month that this statue of Gandhi had been installed in the University of Accra campus, there had been stories in the Indian and African press about racist attacks against Africans in Indian cities, in places like Delhi and Bangalore. And this was something that the protesters mentioned. They said, if there is an intention to deepen relations between India and Africa, this might be better assured by tackling instances of racism against Africans in Indian cities than installing statues of somebody who arguably had racist and casteist views. So this third point, you could say, had less to do with Gandhi than to do with the shifting position of India, the shifting place of India in the African imaginary. You could say that India had gone from being, a leader in the vanguard of post-colonial states, speaking truth to geopolitical power, to an exemplar of that kind of geopolitical power itself. And here the protesters were also referencing India's increasingly, what they saw as India's increasingly imperialist interventions in the African continent by way of investment, by way of land grabs alongside China. So this, you could say, meant that Gandhi had been transformed from a symbol of ahimsa, of nonviolence, to a cipher for the might of this newer and uglier India in the eyes of what used to be called the Third World. I want to also maybe contrast what was unfolding in India with, what was unfolding in Ghana with contemporaneous developments in India, where the enterprise of iconographic decolonization has taken the form much more of building statues. So the Dalit movement in India has built hundreds and thousands of statues of Ambedkar, their foremost leader, who was also the architect of the Indian Constitution. You can see these statues all over the country at all sorts of scales, from very small, humble statues in villages, often erected at the expense of the local Dalit community, to really quite large statues put up by state governments, particularly in a state like Uttar Pradesh when it was ruled by a Dalit party. Many upper caste intellectuals and politicians have complained that this is a waste of money. But in fact, this sort of high-minded criticism has not impeded the construction of statues by the Hindu right, statues of their favorite figures and icons. So it may be of interest to the audience to know that the tallest statue in the world currently stands in India, in the state of Gujarat. It's twice the size of the Statue of Liberty. It was built at a cost of some $450 million US, and it has only recently come up. And this statue commemorates Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who's the first Home Minister of India, who's credited with forging the Indian Union, partly through the use of coercion in places like Kashmir. But this figure has now become an icon for the Hindu right, in part because he hails from Narendra Modi's home state of Gujarat, but also because he personifies the kind of muscular nationalism that the BJP champions and wishes to propagate in India today. So what we see in India is a series of rival statue building projects, both by Dalits and by the Hindu right. I think some centrist public intellectuals have sort of posited a moral equivalence between these rival statue building projects. I don't think these are morally equivalent at all. I think it actually poses the question of who needs statues and who does not. And how we adjudicate that question has to do with our reading of power in a society and a community. I think controversial as that question might be, and subjective as it might be, it is an inescapable question in confronting the issue of iconographic representation in complex multicultural societies today. So I'll stop there, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Raoul, for your presentation. Perhaps won't be holding you much longer because I believe you have to leave, right? So, but thank
yeah,
you. Thank you for broadening the perspective. We'll now move on to Lian Tsei, who will discuss some past events in Hong Kong.
Yes. Hello, let me start sharing my screen. Actually, I'd like to use the experience of Hong Kong around the change of sovereignty from Britain to China and its relationship with its colonial heritage as a kind of contrasting account, you know, showing how and why Hong Kong people tried to save their heritage. Essentially, Hong Kong's relationship with its colonial past is quite different and unique. But to set the background, it is not that Hong Kong people are in favor of the colonial rule. I mean, many Hong Kong people, older generation especially, remember the time of discrimination, a gaping wealth gap and power gap. And some people actually found that period deeply humiliating. Besides, Hong Kong people take their Chinese roots very seriously, given that many people's ancestors actually immigrated from China to Hong Kong. But Hong Kong's identity is very unique and had developed into a distinctive hybrid of cultures, deeply Chinese, but very much influenced by British values, like the rule of law, capitalism, independent judiciary, and with a, you know, an international outlook. Besides, it is a fact that Hong Kong developed from a fishing village to a very prosperous city during the colonial era. And people in Hong Kong actually take pride of this as their fruits of their hard work. After the handover in 1997, many symbols that represented the British rule were actually removed. But there are two incidents surrounding that change of sovereignty period that showed a very interesting side of how Hong Kong people view their cultural colonial heritage. So for the first one is the statue of Queen Victoria. You can see from the screen. It is a bronze sculpture that was brought to Hong Kong in like 1896. Originally placed in the Statue Square in the center of Hong Kong. So, you know, very typical demonstration of colonial power. During the Japanese occupation, it was actually removed by the Japanese army and it was almost melted down. But it was recovered and it was moved to a public park, which it still stands till this day. But in 1996, just 1 year before the transfer of sovereignty, a mainland Chinese artist called Pan Xing Lui poured red paint over the statue and dented the statue's nose with a hammer. Pan claimed that it was an act of protest against colonialism and Hong Kong people's lack of cultural integrity, urging for a cultural reunification with the Red China. However, not only was he sentenced to 28 days in jail, he was severely criticized by the community. People remembered this act as, act by a mentally ill individual as he was sent for a psychiatric examination by the police. And the use of red paint, and also striking with a hammer, reminded people of the Red Guards and associated this with the extreme left. But columnists and cultural critics argued that he had no right to damage a commonly owned cultural relic, a statue that carries public memory, whether it was of the unjust colonial experience or just simply personal nostalgia. And this notion of collective memory is even more evident in the protests against the demolition of the Star Ferry Pier and the Queen's Pier 10 years after the handover, especially when it was a demolition of a monument forced down by officials rather than initiated by the people. And it also highlighted the inadequacy of the heritage laws in Hong Kong. So this is the Star Ferry Pier, which was demolished in 2006. It was built in 1957. It was then the busiest public pier in the city, providing cheapest and the shortest route from Kowloon to Central. Adjacent to the Star Ferry Pier is the Queen's Pier. This is a 1954 replacement of the old pier that was used since the 1925. But this was primarily a ceremonial pier, the landing place for colonial governors and British royals. The secondary role was it was a public pier for leisure boats and open public space for people. But in the fall of 2006, the government decided to demolish the two piers to give way to more roads and a reclamation project. And protesters against this demolition occupied the two piers, put up banners and set up tents for sit-ins, and even went on a hunger strike. And on the last day of the ferry service at the Star Ferry Pier, more than 15,000 people attended a candlelit vigil. And when the police came to the Queen's Pier to clear it, protesters actually changed themselves to the pier. You can see here. So this intensity of the movement is actually unprecedented in Hong Kong's history of heritage preservation, given the lack of space, rapid urban development, and the policy of high land prices. Heritage preservation is not the city's priority. In the 1980s and 1990s, actually many Western and Chinese urban buildings developed during the Victorian, Edwardian periods were rapidly dismantled with little opposition. So the protest against the demolition of the piers was almost like an awakening for Hong Kong people on their disappearing heritage. A popular local newspaper back then described the pier as once being the seedbed of social activism, because this refers to a mass riot in the 1966, where a student staged a hunger strike outside the Star Ferry Pier in protest against the British government's decision to raise the ferry fare. He was arrested the next day and prompted thousands of young people to take to the streets in mass riot. This event was provoked basically the first mass protests involving many young people confronting a local issue, and subsequently led to a series of social reforms by the colonial government. So in the protest against the demolition of the Star Ferry Pier, people insisted that the historical and social values of the place should even be preserved in situ. A banner near the clock tower of the Star Ferry Pier read, "Our Hong Kong story landmark is vanishing. We don't want a clock in a museum. We just want living history." And at the Queen's Pier, people staged a ceremony to symbolize public landing at the pier by the people, rather than the past history where it's used for royals. And so this is like a shift of from state power to citizenship. And people wore T-shirts saying "People's Land, no king." And the message is, they've been saying colonial rulers have used to land in Hong Kong from the Queen's Pier, but now that the colonial power has gone, the public wants to take over. And about 100 people from all walks of life participated in this public landing. And the newspaper commented, this is no longer just collective memory, but collective action. So this is making of history, as Richard just now mentioned. And then going to a more legal aspect, this incident also really shows the inadequacy of the heritage laws in Hong Kong. The Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance is the only legislation present in Hong Kong governing heritage and antiquities. It gives the government a large discretion to declare a building to be a monument for protection. It may consult Antiquities Advisory Board, which grades buildings based on merit for preservation, but the government is not bound by the board's advice. So even a grade 1 heritage museum, which means that it has the highest historical merit, is not protected from demolition unless the government declares it a monument. And also there is little the ordinance can do when the building is privately owned. The Star Ferry Pier fell 2 years short of the general 50-year minimum age required to be considered for historical grading. And the Queen's Pier was actually classified as a grade 1 building by the Antiquities Advisory Board. However, when the case went to the court for judicial review, the court confirmed that the government only had to take the advice into consideration. After weighing against other relevant matters, it had the discretion to consider that the pier did not possess the requisite historical significance for it to be declared as a monument. Perhaps, owing to largely its European origins, the ordinance still focuses very much on monumental heritage over other historical significances. But much of Hong Kong is not old enough compared to European monuments, but nevertheless holds heritage value, especially when it's a site that embodies the evolution of Hong Kong's very multi-layered and culture and collective identity. So I'd like to end my presentation with a visual for you to remember. I think this work from the museum that I work at, M+, nicely visualizes the complex discussions of Hong Kong's identity, which the artist actually wants to convey. You see here is actually a Hong Kong pageant winner posed like Queen Elizabeth's portrait, which is commonly found in colonial government offices. But against a background of a Chinese Qing dynasty court painting. And I'll leave the rest of it for you to interpret. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leanne. I should have said that actually I didn't introduce you properly. You're actually one of the few lawyers on the panel. You're a graduate of the Chinese University in Hong Kong, and you have also studied cultural heritage law. You now work at M+, but you are of course speaking today in your personal capacity. But it was very interesting to hear about the shortcomings of the laws in Hong Kong with regard to heritage protection. We don't have much time left, so before we pick up a couple questions from the audience, I will just ask one kind of general question to Elke Selter. Elke, you are about to finish your PhD at SOAS. You're looking at the politics around heritage protection globally, but you've actually worked as a heritage consultant for over 15 years all around the world, in Mali, South Sudan, in Asia, in Haiti, etc. So my question to you would be, how does the conceptualization that has been made of heritage at the global level, and that includes our understanding of heritage or the way heritage protection has been enshrined in international treaty, how has this can inform the responses, the preservationist responses to the removal of the statues? We have here, for example, Boris Johnson, who has said that he is not in favor of the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford. He said, I'm pro-heritage, I am pro-history. So what does the concept of heritage has to say about this?
Thanks, Christine, and hello, everyone. So I'll talk a bit more in general, and I think your Prime Minister is in a famous or infamous company when he makes this kind of statements, because what we have seen among a lot of people who are part of the public debate, whether in mainstream media or in social media, is that they resort to these seemingly abstract terms like history or heritage, right? And it happens at a quite high level. So you just mentioned Boris Johnson. We see Trump doing it a lot. We also see President Macron in France doing it. So, so you have people who are on quite a number of issues on the rather opposite ends of a political spectrum, resorting to a similar type of argument when they talk about these things like heritage. Of course, it's easier, right? It's much easier to talk about heritage or history than to talk about concrete persons and what they've done and what they represent. But it does more than that, I think, because it turns a discussion towards something where there seems to be universal agreement on, right? Heritage should not be erased, and heritage should not be destroyed, and history should not be erased. So when someone equates the toppling of the statues with the erasing of history or the destruction of heritage, they are actually arguing in favor of keeping the statues, right? And I won't get into all the reasons there are for explaining that toppling statues doesn't equate erasing history, but I will look a bit more in how we got there. How does it come that we seem to think that destruction of heritage is something unacceptable? And for me, where it gets really interesting is that you see this really being used by so many different types of people. So for the Trumps of this world, it's somewhat understandable because he and many with him have been very critical of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is just another one of these examples, right? But there's also people, and I'm from Belgium myself, and I see this happening here with mayors, with academics who are middling in the debate, who seem to be supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, yet they talk about it as it means destroying heritage. And it has this connotation of, you can fight racism all you want, or even I'm happy to help you fight racism all you want, but please leave the heritage out of it. And some of you, of the previous speakers, have given other examples of this. I think there was a good statement of Bristol, I think, in the beginning of this webinar. So in all of this, heritage seems to be this firm line that you can't cross, right? As soon as something becomes heritage, and monuments and statues seem to automatically be considered heritage, it becomes a no-go zone, something that can't be touched anymore. Now, to understand how we got there, you have to look through the whole history of how heritage became a global norm. And I'm not only meaning that in a legal sense, that too, but in a social political sense. And we don't have time to look at this whole process, but I do want to highlight two moments that are quite important for this. And one is 19th century Europe, when heritage became a matter of governance. And I'm overly simplifying all of this, but states started making rules and laws for how heritage should be cared for, preventing its destruction, for example. And in order to do that, you also need to be able to define what heritage is, because otherwise it's kind of hard to apply a law to it. So two things emerged from that. One was a very elitist, material, masculine interpretation of what heritage is. Think of castles and palaces, cathedrals, statues of kings and crusaders and what have you. And the other is that preserving heritage meant that we had to keep things as they were, freezing it in time, as it were. And with a preference for old materials. So we, and I'm talking as a European here, came to value something because it's old, in terms of the material, the stones, the bricks, all of that. All around the world, people have heritage. What they value, how they take care of it has diverged, or used to diverge at least, widely among different cultures. A second element in time that's important is when UNESCO was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. And UNESCO is the UN agency with a mandate for heritage. It's the only one at that level. And from that moment on, this European notion of what is heritage and what we should do with it was moved to an international level. So you can see for the first 40, 50 years of their history, how they devised these international conventions like the World Heritage Convention that we may all know. But they also did loads of projects. They sent around experts around the world telling governments how to make their own laws, how to make management systems for heritage and so on and so forth, all with this aim of making heritage conservation something that governments did. And somewhere around, let's say 85, 90, it was kind of globally spread. Countries all over the world preserved heritage. That was the right thing to do. And of course, it hasn't always been like that, right? Heritage, by its very nature, has been always something that evolved, that was negotiated within a society, within a community. But by making it a sector of governance, and especially also international governments, you put it, you squeeze it somehow in some sort of straitjacket. You define that some things are heritage and others aren't. And once something is heritage, it means you can do certain things with it and you can't do other things with it anymore. And that has had as a result that many people no longer see heritage as something that continuously evolves and is renegotiated. And of course, within academia, there's loads of people who write about this and it's kind of commonly understood, but within the general public and at a political level, there seems to be another understanding of what heritage is. An aspect that I didn't mention, and I won't go in detail on it, is that it was, while doing that, also universalized, right? So when we get into attempts to reopen that public debate around heritage, the fact that now heritage seems to be something that everybody interferes with makes it much harder to answer questions as to who should be having this debate. If in Bristol you want to have a discussion about the statue, should it be the inhabitants of Bristol or in Brussels, or should it be all the Belgians or the Flemish speakers, all the French speakers? Should it involve the diaspora community? Should it involve maybe the Congolese people? Or will it be something the entire world is going to be part of? And all of that has become a lot more complex. Now, the norm itself is actually quite simple. It tells us that heritage preservation is good and destruction is bad. Even that it is a crime, right, to destroy heritage. But having such a simple norm is very hard in complex situations like the one of the statues, because now we have a situation when actually preserving heritage is not the desirable option. Where talking about things like heritage, the way that Boris Johnson does, has actually become an excuse for not doing the right thing. And with that, I mean, it perpetuates systemic racism through heritage, right? We just say these statues have to remain. Now, for the Trumps of this world, it's very useful, but it's, I think, a pity almost that those who are in principle supportive of the movement also resort to these discussions about this is heritage and we should probably keep it, because they seem to be defending two seemingly opposing sets of principles. One is that they are in favor of greater equality, and the other is that this heritage has to be kept. And so they are the ones who are usually proposing these, what I find quite bizarre suggestions, like we'll keep the Leopold II statue and put an explanatory sign underneath, and then that sign basically says that we don't really want to keep the statue. So why do we keep it? Or what Bambi also mentioned, the Ostend case, where they want to put a counter statue on the other side of the square. Now I'm going to finish with one last point on this. And that is that for me, what is very telling is that the heritage sector is not really responding. With an exception of museums, and already quite a few people mentioned museums, because I think they have a slightly different role in this. But organizations like UNESCO haven't said a thing. And so is the case for most other big heritage organizations in the world. And within a normalized context, I understand that, right? Partially because they depend on this norm, but also because these rules and regulations do kind of work most of the time. And if you're gonna start making exceptions, you create this gray area, right? Which is very risky. So if you go out and make a statement saying, you know, heritage needs to be preserved, and we just spent 75 years telling all of you that that's what you need to do, but maybe there are certain exceptions in which case heritage can be destroyed. And actually destruction here isn't even really destruction, it's just moving it into another place probably. If you're gonna do that, you start walking down a very slippery slope. And it seems to be a risk that they are not willing to take. So as a result, you see there's a lot of bottom-up movement. So there's communities taking this into their own hands. There's local governments who will start the debate. But in terms of a top-down discussion, there isn't all that much happening. And so, yeah, I'll just finish on that because I think it's a real pity, because by not speaking up, and I think a lot of these organizations in some of their other statements seem supportive of the movement, yet by staying silent on the statues issue in itself, they're actually supporting the Trump-like statements, because they're supporting a norm which says heritage has to be kept. So they're supporting that these statues should remain by not saying that maybe there's an opening for removing them.
Thank you so much, LK. I think that was quite striking to hear that UNESCO hasn't said anything, because I mean, part of their mandate is, of course, I mean, the promotion of culture, the protection of culture, but also the advancement of human rights. And here we're talking about global movements seeking racial equality and the application of human rights, and the fact that there has been no response and no reaction is quite striking. I will now hand it over to Professor Stephen Gallagher to conclude. We have very little time, but I think he may be able to just place one question to the panelists before we conclude.
Thank you very much, Kristin, and thank you very much to all the speakers. It was great. We have run out of time, but that's great because everyone's presentations were so good, and it was so interesting to hear and learn from all of you. But just one thing that did strike me from a couple of the questions coming in, and we have a number of questions there. Some of them have already been answered, but maybe going back first to Marty, and maybe others would like to come in on this point as well. Marty, you were talking about your experience in Bristol with the Colston Statue, and how your brother used to go there for his school and you'd walk past it and everything. One of the points that was made by some of the questioners, that often people are ignorant of what these statues actually represent. And there was a question about whether we need more education. Was there education? Did you find out through your own inquiries, or was there an educational program, and should there be more education around this?
No, I think that's essentially been part of the problem, is that you have these statues and nobody knows why they exist. I mean, until this whole debate about the Colston statue, I didn't really, you know, there are other statues in Bristol, and unless they've gone up recently, like the Cary Grant statue, they just exist and are there. You have no idea. And so the whole, going back to your last speaker, if that whole idea about why a statue is there and is it part of your heritage, I think more Bristolians know now why the Colston statue is there, and it's been attached to sort of the city's identity, but really only because as a result of this discussion. I mean, until the 90s, I just thought that Colston was this person that obviously came from the past, but I had no idea about what he did and why he was venerated in the city. So that at least this whole discussion, which has been going on for some time, you know, much longer than him being toppled, at least now, you know, at least now people know why it's there and are having a honest debate about it. And I think the lack of education in this country about Britain's past, and particularly the sort of more unsavoury parts of it, as you know, the lack of education about that is terrible. People, you tend to, as a sort of Black Bristolian, I was taught about the slave trade, but primarily the abolition and Britain's involvement in that, but not Britain's involvement in, you know, doing so well at it. And also, you know, the industrialization of sugar, I wasn't taught about that, and the methods by which they did that, which involved pretty much abject cruelty on the plantations. So the lack of honest teaching of history has resulted in us having not informed debates about what we want to venerate in our cities. And I think at least this this whole debate about should Colston's statue stay, should Colston Halls remain, has meant that we've had where we are in the midst of having a discussion about our shared history.
Thank you very much, Marty. Sorry, Julian.
If I may follow up on what Marty just said, it's interesting because I think, Marty, in your talk, you mentioned the linkage between Bristol and Bordeaux. And in Bordeaux, where a lot of the slave ships departed from, there's been local initiatives to contextualize the street signs that bear the names of slave traders. But these initiatives are all grassroots and have all come, as Elke mentioned, from high school students or local associations and not from the top down. So people are basically self-educating themselves, and this is not coming from the Ministry of National Education.
Absolutely the same in Bristol, and the movement to contextualise the statue, which perhaps if the contextualisation had happened, the statue would be there now. But actually, that also, I would consider that was a grassroots movement in Bristol that got thwarted by the powers that be, which then instead had a huge debate over whether the facts were right. And maybe if there, as I said, if there'd been some form of contextualisation, it wouldn't have been torn down.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to end it because BICL have another event coming up in their busy schedule. I would like to ask Julian about his comments in his writings about indifference as well, with the French mural as well, and all of the other speakers. Apologies for not being able to get back to you with another question, but thank you all for your excellent presentations. Thanks very much to BICL. Thanks very much to Liam for his background and organising everything, and in particular, of course, to Kristin for organising all of this when she wasn't feeling too well and she was also away at one point as well. So thank you on behalf of BICL and on behalf of Kristin. Thank you on behalf of CUHK Law as well, and hope to see you again in the future, because I think we need to revisit this and talk more about this, because there's obviously lots of things that we could deal with. Thank you very much, and good evening from Hong Kong. Bye-bye.